Welcome to today's webinar titled Tobacco Product Waste, a Toxic Challenge. My name is Tom Pryor. I'm a staff attorney at the Public Health Law Center, and presenting with me today is my colleague, Carolina Saavedra. We both provide legal technical assistance on commercial tobacco control issues to public health professionals and organizations nationwide. Carolina and I both focus on the emerging issue of tobacco product waste, and we're very happy to be here today to discuss this important topic with you. The Public Health Law Center is located at Mitchell-Hamline School of Law in St. Paul, Minnesota. We acknowledge that we are on the indigenous homelands of the Dakota people, also known as the Sioux Nation, and that 4 federally recognized Dakota tribal nations remain in this area, and that there's a resilient and thriving indigenous population here working to reclaim and revitalize the land and to strengthen the community. The Public Health Law Center is made up of a dedicated team of attorneys, policy analysts, and support staff who work nationwide on public health policies in the areas of commercial tobacco control, healthy eating, active living, and climate justice. The Public Health Law Center offers free legal technical assistance to all communities, public health advocates, and other partners. We also publish widely on commercial tobacco control policy and offer trainings and webinars like this one. We do not offer direct legal representation, nor do we lobby. At the Public Health Law Center, we focus more on equity than equality. Equity is about giving people what they need, which includes understanding barriers, circumstances, and conditions. In an equitable society, something like your race, gender, or sexuality should not be predictive of your health or happiness. We also consider it our responsibility to use our legal knowledge to bring justice to public health, which includes addressing the social determinants of health as we support our partners in reducing health disparities. When all people are healthier, the communities are happier, safer, and more vibrant places. I want to give a quick disclaimer at the beginning here that when we talk about tobacco product waste, we're discussing industrial scale commercial tobacco products and the resulting waste, not traditional tobacco, which is used religiously, medicinally, and in the ceremonies of many different cultures and tribal nations. All right, so what is tobacco product waste? The Public Health Law Center defines tobacco product waste in our model policies to mean any component, part, or remnant of any commercial tobacco product. So that includes waste that is produced from the use of tobacco product, including cigarette butts, cigar and cigarillo tips and wrappers, e-cigarettes or vapes, cartridges, and any packaging and incidental waste such as lighters or matches, whether or not it contains tobacco or nicotine. Not only are tobacco products harmful when consumed, but they also produce quite a lot of waste, and that includes plastic waste like wrappers and packaging, and as we'll explain, cigarette butts. It also includes hazardous waste like nicotine, batteries, and toxic metals. Now, as a side note, we say cigarette butts instead of filters because they don't act as a filter. Instead, they just serve to improve the experience of smoking and to make the smoker feel like they're reducing their risk, but they don't actually have any health benefits, and they don't really filter anything out. Quite the contrary, they might encourage people to smoke more cigarettes and to inhale more deeply when they do, making cigarettes with quote-unquote filters potentially more dangerous than those without. One thing we know for certain, however, is that whether you call them filters or butts, they're the most commonly littered object on the planet. And that's a theme when you start to look into tobacco product waste. There are layers of fraud and deception in how these products are marketed, such that people are tricked into using them because they think they're safe for themselves and for the planet, when both are false. The waste from tobacco products ends up in our soil, air, and water. They accumulate in plants and animals, including those that we eat. And this further compounds the negative health effects of tobacco products, adding salt to the collective wound that tobacco already inflicts upon our communities. Importantly, these environmental hazards tend to accumulate in low-income communities or communities of color, areas that are already facing other environmental and public health stresses, making this a health equity and environmental justice issue. Let's focus in on some of the main types of tobacco product waste, though, beginning with cigarette butts. There's a cultural norm, one that is encouraged by the media and big tobacco, to simply flick smoked cigarettes on the ground instead of throwing them away, a practice that's caused in part by the mistaken belief that cigarette butts are biodegradable and do not harm the environment. Because of this, and because of the sheer number of cigarettes that are smoked each year, cigarette butts are, as I mentioned, the most littered item in the world. The World Health Organization estimates that 4.5 trillion of them are improperly discarded around the world each year, which is the equivalent of 1.69 billion pounds of toxic garbage. Cigarette butts are not biodegradable. They look like they're made of cotton, but really they're made up of hundreds of thin threads of cellulose acetate, which is a type of plastic. As the paper wrapper around it degrades, these tiny threads of plastic loosen, spread out, and break apart into countless bits of microplastics that are imbued with nicotine and other highly toxic elements from the cigarette itself, such as cadmium and lead and arsenic. These toxic microplastics are then spread throughout rivers, lakes, and oceans and collect in the soil and in any animal or plant that consumes them. They're a major contributor to our planet's microplastic crisis. E-cigarettes pose unique problems too. You can start with an inherent and inescapable part of vapes, which is nicotine in the e-liquid. In addition to being the key component of tobacco products, nicotine was used as a pesticide in the United States until it was banned because of its effects on bee populations. It's also a P-listed acute hazardous waste. The P-list is a classification used by the EPA under the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA, for chemicals that can cause death or serious irreversible illness or that cause permanent damage. These wastes are intended to be the most strictly regulated, which is all to say that nicotine is very toxic. Many lithium-ion batteries are also considered hazardous waste due to their corrosivity, reactivity, ignitability, or toxicity. Wastes that exhibit a certain threshold of any of those characteristics are classified as characteristic hazardous waste under RCRA. So not to put too fine a point on it, but e-cigarette batteries can ignite or explode. And when they do, some have likened them to flamethrowers or flaming rockets. And e-cigarettes and the batteries within them contain metals like nickel and lead. Even if there are small amounts in each product, there are millions of these products sold each year and virtually no way to safely recycle them. And if not properly disposed of, the toxic e-waste can contaminate the ground and the water. Most solid waste facilities are not meant to and are not equipped to handle hazardous waste, especially e-cigarette waste. And e-cigarette products generally do not inform consumers on how to properly dispose of them. Even if a user wanted to take them apart to recycle what portions they can, many of the newer e-cigarettes are not designed to be separated by their components, and attempting to do so can start battery fires or explosions. Thus, due to misinformation about the disposable nature of these devices and insufficient availability of hazardous waste facilities that can safely process them, they often end up in landfills or littering the streets. Here are just a few articles discussing the problems that vapes pose to our waste management system. Proving that this is a global issue, the Observer reports that facilities in the UK have to use artificial intelligence and thermal imaging cameras to detect vapes, because if they don't catch and remove them, they can end up getting chopped up as part of the disposal process, which can and does start fires that are very difficult to put out. On this side of the pond, the Hill estimates that about 5 vapes are thrown away each second, amounting to about 150 million devices ending up in landfills or in the ground over the course of a year. The article goes on to mention that lithium-ion batteries, many of which come from e-cigarettes, are estimated to have caused 240 fires in garbage trucks and waste facilities between 2013 and 2014. Even though we're here to talk primarily about tobacco product waste, it's also important to recognize that tobacco product pollution isn't limited to consumer waste after tobacco products have been used, but also occurs at a huge scale across the entire tobacco product cycle of life, which often occurs overseas, generally impacting the most vulnerable communities around the world. Every part of the tobacco production process produces environmental harms, from the commercial harvesting of tobacco plants to the manufacturing process to delivery. This image shows that to make the roughly 6 trillion cigarette sticks that are produced each year, the tobacco industry consumes over 22 million tons of water, uses over 5 million hectares of land, and in the process produces 25 million tons of solid waste, 84 million tons of carbon emissions, and 55 million tons of wastewater. I'm just doing some back of the envelope math. The tobacco industry's carbon emissions is roughly equivalent to the total annual emissions of about 6 million Americans. So eliminating commercial tobacco altogether would be like if the entire state of Wisconsin became completely carbon neutral overnight. And those are just the figures for cigarettes. Many studies indicate that the lithium used in vapes could be used instead to manufacture thousands of electric cars instead. And this is just another reason that cutting the problem at the source is such a boon for environmental justice and public health. Commercial tobacco products shouldn't be sold in the first place, given their impacts on public health. And keeping this harmful product on the market produces unnecessary environmental harms and uses up resources, especially rare and valuable resources like lithium, that could either be conserved or spent on more valuable pursuits. So the question then is, why haven't we addressed these environmental harms at a national level? Here's the broader landscape of existing federal laws that are related to reducing environmental harms, especially those laws that might or could apply to tobacco products. And unfortunately, as a spoiler, most of these laws fall short when it comes to tobacco product waste. This is just another example of how tobacco products slip through the cracks of our federal regulatory regimes. We'll start with the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, or RCRA, which is, in a nutshell, a law that covers any sort of waste that might be hazardous, either because of the characteristics of that waste or because it contains a substance we know to be hazardous. If you collect enough hazardous waste, you're supposed to follow RCRA's rules for responsibly and safely disposing of it. As we mentioned earlier, liquid nicotine is one of those listed substances that's known to be hazardous, and there's good reason to believe that vapes and e-cigarettes are hazardous because of their characteristics as well. For example, their tendency to ignite and explode. So technically, if you were to collect enough old vapes and e-cigarettes, whether you're a school confiscating them in hallways or you're a retailer who have packages worth of e-cigarettes that you need to throw away, you should have to follow all of RCRA's rules for responsibly disposing of those hazardous products. The reality, though, is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of coordinated effort to enforce RCRA against vape products, although hopefully that's changing in the future. Just as importantly, the EPA hasn't done the analysis to determine if cigarette butts qualify as characteristic hazardous waste, and they don't plan to anytime soon. So the practical effect is that RCRA doesn't cover cigarette butts, even though those certainly are toxic and harmful, especially if collected in large enough quantities. So while RCRA could hypothetically be used to regulate tobacco product waste, it's not currently enforced in a way that does so. We'll turn next to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. NEPA is basically a procedural law. All it does is require that the federal government undertake an environmental review of many of its actions to determine whether there will be an environmental impact and how they can minimize it. It doesn't prohibit the government from harming the environment, it just requires the government, before taking some actions, to draft what's called an environmental impact statement that the public can weigh in on. So it's more about transparency and ensuring the government is taking a hard look at the environmental impacts of its actions. NEPA applies to agency actions taken by the FDA, including the FDA's pre-market authorization of tobacco products. But while the FDA does conduct environmental assessments when granting pre-market tobacco product authorizations, it relies heavily on the tobacco company applicant's own environmental assessment, which almost invariably concludes that there's no finding of significant impact. This is typically because the new products supposedly do not result in new or different environmental harms compared to products that are already on the market. So that indicates the FDA is not really taking a serious cumulative harms assessment of these products. To our knowledge, the FDA has never decided that any of their approvals requires a full environmental impact statement, and certainly has never denied an application because of its environmental impact. The Toxic Substances Control Act regulates, restricts, and tracks chemical substances that pose a substantial risk of injury to the public or the environment at the production, distribution, and importation stages, so before they become waste, which is what distinguishes it from RCRA. However, the TSCA's definition of chemical substances explicitly exempts tobacco products, so it can't be used to rein in tobacco product waste. And finally, there's the Clean Water Act, which aims to protect the water quality of the United States by regulating the discharge of pollutants into navigable waters. But the Clean Water Act only regulates direct discharges of pollutants from point sources of pollution, such as pollutants coming into a body of water through a concentrated point like a pipe or from a water treatment facility, and then only if it reaches navigable waters. The CWA does not directly regulate litter that accumulates over a large area, as cigarette butts do, even if that litter tends to find its way into rivers and streams eventually. Instead, it would literally and figuratively apply downstream by regulating stormwater pipes or other point sources that actually introduce that litter into the navigable water. So even while our waters would be cleaner if tobacco products didn't exist, or at the very least weren't littered, the Clean Water Act can't be used to stop that sort of behavior. Altogether, these are powerful federal laws that could address the environmental harms of tobacco products, but either because of how they are written or because of how they're enforced, they do very little, leaving up to the state and local jurisdictions to pick up the slack. And it's absolutely essential that local public health professionals take up this cause, because environmental health is public health, and because environmental injustice can't be separated from economic and social injustice. Local decisions have a huge impact on where and how burdens are allocated in a community. Local government decisions can dictate, for example, whether a community has grocery stores instead of convenience stores that sell tobacco products. Or to take another example, many local governments have passed ordinances making parks and playgrounds smoke-free, which is an essential step in improving public health. But if lower income areas don't have parks and playgrounds, the people in those areas don't get to enjoy the benefits of those smoke-free policies. When it comes to waste management generally and tobacco product waste specifically, location matters too. If we all had to live near a repository for our garbage, we would probably be more careful about what types of garbage and how much of it we generate. The reality is that we don't all share the trash burden equally. For many of us, there's a sense that the items we throw in the trash just disappear, but obviously they don't. Instead, they end up in waste management facilities that are located in someone else's community. This is also the case for tobacco product waste. So even when cigarette butts make it to a landfill and vapes to a hazardous waste facility, those landfills and facilities are disproportionately located near less wealthy communities of color who then suffer from the odors, toxic air, and other health harms of living near those locations. The people in these communities become burdened not just with their own trash, including tobacco product waste, but with the trash and tobacco waste from more privileged communities as well. Here's just one example of this phenomenon. This is a map created using the EPA's Environmental Justice Mapping tool. It shows the proximity to hazardous waste in various communities in and around Milwaukee and compares it to the population below the poverty level in those same communities. On the left, the warmer and darker colors indicate communities that are in closer proximity to hazardous waste facilities, whereas on the right, the darker shaded areas show communities where there's a larger proportion of people living at or below the poverty level. And just eyeballing these maps, you can see the overlap such that wealthier communities tend to live further away from hazardous waste facilities. So when we talk about tobacco product waste and its hazards to the public health and the environment, we must center these overall waste burden disparities in our discussion and in our policy solutions. It's not enough to merely collect more cigarette butt and e-cigarette litter and to have better waste management processes, because that waste has to go somewhere, and often it ends up in vulnerable communities. This is why at the end of the day, the most effective path to diminishing the compounding environmental injustices of tobacco product waste is the path that leads to endgame. And so with that, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Caroline, who's going to talk about some of those policy options.
Thank you, Tom. That was a perfect explanation of the problem. So now let's talk about solutions. So as Tom explained, tobacco product waste is not only an environmental problem, but it is also an environmental injustice problem. Where this waste goes can compound existing inequities in regards to toxic exposure and access to clean, safe spaces. For this reason, it is imperative to focus on policy solutions that center environmental justice. In this regard, the most effective will be those that cut the source of the waste, reduce the spread of existing waste, and make a commitment to invest time and resources, and that seek to push the burdens away from local government and onto the industry. In the next few slides, we will walk you through some different types of policy solutions and their varying degrees of effectiveness and equity impacts. As a quick note before we proceed, there may be legal hurdles, some of which can be unique to your jurisdiction, including preemption or lack of local authority to enact certain types of regulations. These may vary widely from one place to another, and jurisdictions should inform themselves when pursuing any policies. So we can think about approaches to dealing with tobacco product waste as falling within a continuum of upstream, midstream, and downstream solutions. In order to better explain these policy streams, it may be helpful to envision a plumbing leak in your house. Everybody has had one at some point, probably. So you have the source point of the leak, where the water is coming from. You have the surfaces that are flooded by the leak, and then you have the surplus water. You want to address all of those. Upstream solutions are akin to plugging the leak or fixing the leak to stop the flow of the water. Midstream solutions are mitigation measures, such as blocking the spreading water before it floods into other rooms, right, and becomes harder to mop up. And downstream solutions are the equivalent of mopping up the water and collecting it and finding an appropriate place to discard it. Just like with a plumbing leak, the tobacco product waste problem needs upstream, midstream, and downstream approaches. Upstream solutions aim to stop and prevent the introduction of tobacco products into the market in the first place, so plugging the leak. Because those products, though, are already in the stream of commerce, midstream solutions aim to first capture them before they are carelessly disposed of, and second, to reduce the cost to local governments of cleaning them up after the fact. And because improperly discarded products are already prolific, downstream solutions will be necessary to address the existing tobacco product litter, for example, through cleanups. These policy solution streams are not mutually exclusive. Aspects of each are going to be necessary, but it is important to note that they are not all equal in effectiveness, especially when pursued alone. Just like with the plumbing analogy, you would not want to put all your efforts into mopping up the floor without also making attempts to plug the leak and contain the spread of the water in the first place. So jurisdictions will need to pursue policies from each stream in order to make headway into eliminating or reducing tobacco product waste from their surroundings. Upstream policy solutions aim to cut the source of tobacco product waste and reduce the amount of products that enter the market. The goal is to fundamentally shift consumption patterns by limiting where and how tobacco products are sold and raising public awareness of their harms. In an ideal world, we could all just implement comprehensive sales bans to most effectively plug the leak. A couple of jurisdictions have boldly implemented such bans. Of course, this is not currently feasible everywhere for various reasons, ranging from lack of community support to laws that hamstring local authority. Aside from comprehensive bans on the sale of tobacco products, other upstream solutions that push the burdens onto the industry include sales restrictions, restrictions on retailer location, and upstream educational campaigns. For sales restrictions, jurisdictions can consider prohibiting the sale of single-use tobacco products, such as disposable vapes, cigarettes with butts, and plastic tips and mouthpieces for other combustible products. New York State currently has a pending bill that aims to do exactly this. So make sure you tune in to our colleagues' webinar at the end of September to learn more about New York's specific efforts. Jurisdictions can also consider restricting the sale of products that become mixed hazardous waste, particularly those that cannot be recycled locally. For example, products that contain liquid nicotine, which is an acute hazardous waste, and also electronic waste from lithium batteries, which is a different class of hazardous waste. Also, it is important to note that policies that are not specifically crafted to deal with tobacco product waste, such as general single-use plastic bans or plastic packaging bans, can often still apply to tobacco product waste, depending on how the language is drafted. And retailer restrictions are another good upstream policy that can center equity, because tobacco retailers tend to be located near low-income communities and communities of color. To address this problem, jurisdictions can adopt retailer restrictions that limit the density of retailers in specific geographic areas, or they can limit the proximity of retailers to places that are frequented, particularly by youth, for example, by setting minimum distance requirements from the retail stores to schools, parks, and other recreational areas. Limiting the proximity of retailers to each other is another good way to avoid saturation of tobacco product availability in any one particular place. And another upstream solution is to shift consumer understanding and consumption patterns to diminish tobacco use and prevent initiation by educating the public and youth in particular about the environmental harms of tobacco products. Unfortunately, there is a lack of awareness even among people who smoke or use tobacco products about just how toxic and ubiquitous tobacco product waste is, how much money and resources it takes from local governments to address this, and that there is no universally accessible and environmentally sound solution for what to do with this toxic waste even once it's collected. So a lot of the time, like Tom pointed out, it ends up in landfills or incineration facilities that are near some communities and maybe not others. So education campaigns can garner community buy-in for adopting upstream solutions that we just mentioned. Now, here are some examples of upstream solutions that have been implemented. For example, in Manhattan Beach in California, they banned the sale of all tobacco products starting in 2021. They allowed for a one-time hardship exception applications for existing retailers, but with rigorous documentary requirements and a city council hearing. Beverly Hills in California also maintains this tobacco retailer licensing program, but stopped issuing retailer licenses in 2019 for most tobacco retailers, except for certain exceptions. The town of Brookline, Massachusetts has adopted a nicotine-free generation law that will prohibit the sale of all tobacco products within the city to persons born after January 1st of 2000, no matter how old they get. So this is a different type of endgame policy that seeks to prevent initiation to tobacco use in younger generations. The city of Watsonville, in the rural part of California, bans the sale of most e-cigarettes within the city by prohibiting retailers from selling e-cigarettes or vapes that require FDA pre-market authorization but have not received it, which should be most e-cigarettes, particularly disposable ones. For place-based retailer restriction examples, we have the District of Columbia, which bans the sales of vapes within a quarter mile of a middle or high school. New Orleans prohibits tobacco retailers from being located within 300 feet of any school, park, public library, childcare facility, or church. And Chicago bans tobacco and vape shops from being located within 1,000 feet of other tobacco and vape shops, or within 500 feet of any secondary school in the city. And finally, San Francisco and New York City both have adopted retailer density restriction formulas that limit the number of tobacco retailers that can operate within each district in the city. So now let's take a look at Midstream Solutions, which aim to lessen the cost of litter collection by containing the waste from spreading further after the products have already entered the market, but also by charging consumers or retailers additional fees for litter abatement. So some examples of these, as I mentioned, are litter abatement fees and potentially deposit return schemes. So the primary purpose of these litter abatement fees is to pass some of the costs of the litter onto the consumer. This may allow jurisdictions to fund cleanup and disposal programs, while at the same time increasing the cost of tobacco products to the consumer. The downside is that these fees do not address the unmitigated cost of tobacco product waste litter, for example, from leachates, and because it is just not possible to, even with all the funding in the world, to pick up every cigarette butt or vape product, right? So deposit and return schemes are also a similar concept, particularly for e-cigarettes and other electronic smoking devices. And they seek to collect the waste at specific locations in order to avoid the improper discarding, right? So the waste basically continuing to spread farther away from the point sources, which are the retailers. So as far as I'm aware, deposit return schemes have not really been tried, and jurisdictions that are considering them should proceed with caution. For example, deposit schemes should be accompanied by rigorous enforcement of federal and local hazardous waste disposal requirements for whichever establishment is going to collect the waste. So if it is a retailer, it could significantly increase the costs of business and legal liabilities, which could incentivize retailers to stop selling the products altogether. However, in order for such a scheme to work, it would require significant time and dollar investments from local governments to ensure compliance with hazardous waste laws. Moreover, if the user is getting some money or discount back the next time they return to the retailer with their used up vape, this could incentivize the continued purchasing of tobacco products. And of course, there are also some equity concerns, such as who exactly will end up having to handle all those return waste items. Then we have voluntary manufacturer efforts and retailer requirements, such as extended producer responsibility models like take-back schemes, where the manufacturer takes the used up product back for recycling or proper disposal at little or no cost to the consumer. These types of programs already exist for things like printer cartridges, computers, and other e-waste, though not for tobacco products, as far as I know. If tobacco manufacturers started to take back the products they create, this could certainly push the cleanup costs to them and potentially incentivize them to branch out to less hazardous business models. But tobacco products contain consumable toxic materials that can leak, leach, or in the case of vapes, as Tom explained, they can explode. And that presents safety concerns that go beyond other types of extended producer responsibility programs. I just don't see the industry jumping at this opportunity. And even if they did, there is a big potential for industry greenwashing and giving false comfort to consumers that their products are not so environmentally harmful. So again, another potential policy, but proceed with caution. Other potential manufacturer or retailer measures could be requiring labeling or warning signs that alert consumers that certain tobacco products are hazardous waste and explain proper disposal processes. This could raise consumer awareness. However, these could run into some legal roadblocks. So it would be important to reach out for technical assistance when considering them. Jurisdictions could also seek to enforce existing hazardous waste regulations on tobacco retailers that dispose of e-cigarettes or other businesses where these devices accumulate. Federal law requires that generators of hazardous waste, that is, persons whose act first causes the hazardous material to become waste in the first place, they must register as generators, follow strict procedures for storage transportation of and storage and transportation of the hazardous waste. And they should also have a contingency plan in case of any unexpected mishaps, and also ensure that staff are adequately trained, among other requirements. For example, the cities of Chelsea and Somerville, both in Massachusetts, require tobacco retailers to comply with the state's hazardous waste regulations and to provide a written plan to the city for how they intend to dispose of liquid nicotine containers that break, spill, or expire. Implementation of these policies, of course, can entail a greater investment of resources by local government to make sure that they can do compliance checks and train their own staff as to these requirements. So while those resources would be very well spent, communities with limited resources may want to determine if those investments can maybe be moved further upstream. Another midstream solution is tobacco product use restrictions. So these would be smoke-free or tobacco-free laws, just like Tom mentioned earlier, which can reduce tobacco product waste litter by reducing the areas where tobacco products may be used. These are effective at creating clean air conditions and less dispersed waste, especially when coupled with education campaigns and other upstream policies such as sales restrictions. These laws, as they exist in much of the country, tend to protect parks and green spaces, which reduces tobacco product waste in those areas, but unfortunately leave communities that do not have those green spaces unprotected. So it would be important to expand their reach. Now, sometimes these ordinances also carry criminal or heavy monetary penalties that, due to disparate enforcement, tend to disproportionately penalize communities of color. So while tobacco product use restrictions are a good tool to reduce tobacco product waste, in order to be the most effective overall and to be equitable, they should be drafted or amended with environmental justice and equity in mind. And if smoke-free laws have been drafted prior to the vaping epidemic, it is a good idea to revise them and update the language to ensure that they also ban the use of hazardous products such as vapes and e-cigarettes. So there are promising midstream solutions, but if done without complementary upstream solutions, they are less likely to be effective at reducing tobacco product waste overall. And you can't litter what you can't buy, so upstream solutions that cut tobacco products off at the source will necessarily be the most effective policies. Now, finally, downstream solutions such as cleanups and anti-litter laws focus on cleaning up or eliminating litter once it's already been discarded improperly. Now, on their own, downstream solutions are the least likely to achieve denormalization of tobacco use, to achieve substantial reductions in tobacco product waste or to center environmental justice goals. Now, to the extent that downstream solutions focus on individual responsibility, they also shift the blame from the producers of this toxic material to the individual consumers and drive the efforts that penalize consumer behavior, often through disparate enforcement, as mentioned before, which can place additional burdens on the very communities that are already targeted by the tobacco industry's marketing practices. So while cleanups are absolutely necessary, they have a high potential for greenwashing, particularly where the industry sponsors them. So when conducting these, let's make sure that they're done correctly. After all, the tobacco industry has spearheaded anti-litter campaigns, funded distribution of handheld ashtrays or ash cans for smokers, and funded cleanups in order to greenwash the problem and direct efforts away from reducing the source of the waste. Now, other downstream attempts to deal with the problem of cigarette butt litter have led to some very questionable recycling practices in multiple areas of the world. Cigarette butts have been used to make jackets in France, park benches in Philadelphia, and most recently, stuffed animals and bug repellent. So here are some snapshots of an article covering a factory in India whose workers separate the tiny fibers from discarded cigarette butts to harvest the cellulose acetate and turn it into a sort of cigarette butt gin to use as stuffing in children's toys. And there are obvious problems here are that obviously the worker exposure to all the toxic chemicals and metals from taking apart each cigarette butt, also the dust cloud of toxic cigarette butt chemicals from the photo on the right, which just kind of evokes a respiratory nightmare. And of course, the children that will end up playing and hugging toxic teddy bears. That's not to say that all downstream solutions are the same. For example, many schools and school districts are developing policies to dispose of vapes that are confiscated. A few counties across the country have partnered with local hazardous waste disposal facilities to ensure that vapes that accumulate on school grounds can be periodically and safely disposed of at appropriate facilities that are equipped to handle them. Now, on the left is a screenshot from the Boulder County's Vape Aware campaign. They provide schools and even retailers who sign up with necessary materials to safely and temporarily store the waste. And the county also facilitates drop-off or pickup options for those who join the program. Now, this is a great downstream policy option for jurisdictions that have the resources and have a willing hazardous waste recycler nearby to partner with. These also have the additional potential benefit to make students aware that if vapes and e-cigarettes are toxic for the environment, then they're also probably toxic for their bodies. Now, by contrast, on the right, we see a TerraCycle recycling depository for cigarette butts. And as I mentioned in the prior slide, it's questionable whether the plastic from cigarette butts can be recycled safely, because you have to separate the cellulose acetate from everything else. And even then, the little plastic that you get is so contaminated that it's unsafe to use it for most consumer items. It is also not profitable to recycle cigarette butts. It takes 1,000 butts to make 100 grams of plastic. So to keep the program afloat, for example, TerraCycle partners with cigarette manufacturers, as reported by Bloomberg. Now, this is essentially a greenwash version of an ashtray. It encourages smoking because it makes it seem like there's a responsible way of disposing of cigarette litter. And then it shifts the blame for cigarette butt litter from tobacco manufacturers and onto the people who smoke them. All the while with the dubious promise that the butts are ever going to be recycled in a sustainable fashion, as we saw in the prior slide. So not all downstream solutions are made the same. Again, some of them, like school vape policies, are necessary programs designed to actively deal with and mitigate a pressing problem or to mop up the existing mess. Others, like ashtrays or questionable cigarette butt recycling programs, are just passive attempts to shift responsibility. Now, finally, as an alternative or in addition to developing tobacco product waste policies, jurisdictions could consider litigation. At least one jurisdiction already has. In Baltimore, v. Philip Morris, the city of Baltimore is suing the tobacco industry over the cost of cleaning up cigarette butt waste for the damage to its land, aquatic resources, for decreased property values, and for lost revenue as a result of this persistent litter in their jurisdiction. The case is currently in the midst of a procedural dispute over whether it's litigated in state or federal court. So there's a long way to go before we learn the substantive outcome. But this sort of lawsuit has a potential to bring about some important change, and we will certainly continue to keep an eye on it. Now, for relief, the city wants the tobacco companies to help pay for the cost of cleaning up the cigarette butts, which amounts to millions of dollars, and also to stop selling plastic cigarette butts in Baltimore. Now, on its own, that sort of outcome wouldn't necessarily break the bank for big tobacco, but if Baltimore were successful and multiple cities and states were to follow suit, the aggregate effects could be quite substantial. And now this kind of brings me to the just mentioned the dual litigations, which were not related to tobacco product waste. But it is important to note that many jurisdictions throughout the country are going to be receiving substantial monetary payments from JUUL. 48 states and territories in the city of Columbia reached litigation settlements with JUUL, and JUUL will pay them a total of $462 million to 32 states and Puerto Rico over the next few years. They will also pay $175 million to 6 states and DC, and another combined $200 million to 8 states that settled individually. And the JUUL litigations were based on JUUL's role in the youth vaping epidemic through their targeted marketing campaigns of flavor products and product labeling meant to entice young people, and their negligence in preventing the sales of the product to underage consumers. So not based on the waste that they produced. No, but obviously they were some of the forerunners for the vape epidemic. So ideally, states could use a portion or would use a portion of their JUUL settlements to research and fund local jurisdictions to address vape waste. However, each settlement agreement outlines how the settlement funds will be used. So some states are more specific than others in directing which agencies will receive the funds and for what purposes. A few states will direct the funds to law enforcement. Most states will also use the funds to increase cessation and public education efforts. And Now, because young people respond with interest to environmental concerns, making them aware of the hazardous components of tobacco product waste and the difficulties of dealing with it would be a good fit for the cessation and education efforts. Now, whether any of these funds can be used to address tobacco product waste more directly will vary greatly. Some states allow more generalized allocations, including for any lawful purpose, but not all. So similarly with the multi-district settlements, which is a separate settlement that was reached by Jewel, not from the state attorney generals, but from specific districts and cities across the country. So the consent decrees for those as well will determine how those funds will be allocated. And if you want to go to our website, we do have an interactive Jewel settlement map for the Attorney General settlements on our website. So those are the state settlements. And that includes the consent decrees for each state and territory. And so you are welcome to check those out. So finally, to recap, the ultimate goal of tobacco product waste policies must be to cut the source of the waste and litter in the first place. Tobacco product waste can't continue to be generated if there are no tobacco products. Because of disparate municipal services and waste facility siting in overburdened communities, upstream policies are also the best way to achieve environmental justice. However, since tobacco products and tobacco product waste already saturate our world, we also need midstream and downstream solutions that contain and clean up the already existing mess. But these lower stream policies should avoid industry greenwashing traps and focus on environmental justice and equity. So midstream and downstream solutions on their own will not plug the leak. So they should be implemented in tandem with upstream policies. And that basically come to the end of our presentation. Thank you all so much for attending the webinar. And now Tom and I are more than happy to take your questions.
I did get one question that I wanted to address during the presentation. That question is, what policy solutions would work best in small rural communities, excuse me, with limited resources to enforce penalties? Is there a model policy that could work for rural areas? And I think this is a great question because it emphasizes how there really is no one-size-fits-all approach to addressing the tobacco product waste epidemic. It really has to be tailored to the community, its needs, and its resources. We do have a tobacco product waste toolkit available on our website that has a kind of a la carte menu of policies that map on to the sort of policies that Carolina was discussing today that you can kind of pick and choose from. It's also exactly the sort of thing that you can feel free to reach out to us directly for legal technical assistance on. I'll say just kind of off the cuff, and Carolina, you can jump in and correct me if I'm wrong or add anything. The solutions are really going to be dependent on what's politically viable in your community. As we've been emphasizing and focusing on, upstream solutions are probably going to be the most effective, and they also can be quite cheap, right? If you just prevent retailers from selling tobacco products in the first place, you're not going to have tobacco product waste. If that's not possible, politically or for other reasons, then you want to think again on midstream solutions. So reducing retailer density, reducing the ability of retailers to sell these products in the communities, and reducing the areas in which the products can be used. And you can pair that with downstream solutions, especially if those solutions come with added fees that are levied directly on retailers, distributors, and manufacturers. You can kind of recoup the costs of doing your own cleanup. Sorry, I don't have anything that's exactly tailored for your community, but hopefully those are some ideas, and you've gathered some other ideas from Carolina as part of the presentation as well. Anything to add to that, Carolina?
So I think you basically covered it really well. I think a lot of the time, like you mentioned, funding can be a big obstacle to actually being able to implement some of these upstream policies. And like you mentioned, downstream policies tend to be cheaper and just more feasible. And it's easier to get people on board because they feel like they're getting tangible results pretty quickly, as opposed to having to wait for policies to kick in and make the effort of pushing it through city councils. At the same time, education is going to be a big part of that. So just keeping the conversation alive, reminding people of what these devices are. These are particularly for the vapes, they have little lithium-ion batteries that are hazardous. They can leach really toxic stuff. They can burn you. They can be crushed, like you mentioned, in garbage disposal facilities and potentially cause fires. So, making in particularly youth aware of this problem, making them aware of the environmental harms of these products, I think can really resonate. So maybe tasking schools with not just confiscating these products, which a lot of them are already doing, but also to providing an educational component to that. Maybe not so much focusing on punitive measures, but making sure that they are also relaying that message about the environmental effects and harms from these products.
I'm just going to address a question that showed up in the chat about San Diego. And just the question for those who don't see it is, in San Diego, during our meetings with city policymakers, the focus seems to be on equitable enforcement and enforcement in general, and wanting to know that business stakeholders are on board. How to overcome the first two: reasonable to get buy-in from businesses. I think this is where the rubber meets the road. How do you actually get these policies passed? And obviously there's going to be pushback from the businesses that sell these products, and so it's a difficult thing, and unfortunately it's a bit outside of our wheelhouse, especially when it comes to lobbying and that nature. But I do think it's important to realize as you go into this, if you're going to be pushing for upstream and even midstream policies, you are probably going to get pushback from local businesses who will be impacted by them. And that's really going to be up to you and the policy decision makers about how do you balance those competing priorities? How do you build coalitions to overcome any of that resistance? And what the most effective way is of getting things passed. But with that, I'll say that there is that large menu of options that you can pursue. So even if something like an end game policy or even some of the more restricted midstream policies isn't feasible, there are still things you can do to kind of mop up the problem, using Carolina's metaphor, in the meantime, and as you build those coalitions.
So there's another question asking if we foresee whether there will be any additions or I guess amendments to acts such as RCRA, the TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, or the Clean Water Act, to include tobacco e-waste. So that's a bit more a complicated question. I don't foresee anything like that happening anytime soon. I think that we obviously would take an act of Congress to be able to do, and there would need to be a lot more education of the general public in order to make that happen, and to push lawmakers to actually make sure they want to address this. Tobacco products and e-waste are not necessarily excluded from the Clean Water Act. They are a pollutant, so they would count as a pollutant for that purpose. The problem with the Clean Water Act is how those pollutants enter the navigable waters of the United States. So only certain point sources will actually be regulated. And in fact, the Supreme Court has recently even pared back the types of waters that are actually protected. So those are the hurdles when it comes to some of those federal laws. Oh, for this reason, I should add that starting at the grassroots level and locally is always going to be, probably the best way to lead, and then eventually build up to higher and higher levels of governmental regulation.
And just as an addendum to the previous question about dealing with business resistance to these policies, there was an addition from the same requester pointing out that in Manhattan Beach, the Chamber of Commerce offered free consultations with retailers to help them figure out how to switch their product mixes away from tobacco products to help offset a sales ban. And so I think that's a great example of problem solving, trying to work with folks to overcome some of their kind of bottom line concerns. And again, what that looks like in any given community is going to depend upon the mix of businesses and the political leaders and coalitions that you've been building. But it's a great point to emphasize that you should be creative and flexible as you try to address these problems. So thank you for adding that bit of information.
Okay, and I see another question that asks, how would we suggest sharing tobacco product waste information and data to community groups who may be unfamiliar with the issue? So, this goes back to educational campaigns. There are many materials that are already available that are created by organizations like Truth Initiative and Tobacco Free Kids, and then certain local governments also come up with their own campaigns, like the Vape Aware campaign in Boulder, which also does a lot of education and public messaging. So I think bringing those materials to the forefront, sharing those links, sharing that information that already exists, so you don't have to recreate the wheel, is a good way to be effective. At the same time, partnering with youth-led organizations can also be a huge way to reach the most amount of people, particularly the people who are targeted by the industry for marketing these products.
We have a question about hookah lounges in San Diego and toxic waste dumping into public sewage there. And the request is on whether we have any research conducted on that issue or policies to combat it. So I will say this is California specific. We are coming out with a publication that addresses indoor smoking in California and whether and under what conditions hookah lounges are complying with state laws. It's another great example of, though, how you can pass local ordinances that might address that sort of issue. So hookah lounges can't be leaking toxic water into the public sewage if hookah lounges don't exist in the first place. And so if you can ban indoor smoking, that's one way of addressing it. Different states are going to have different sort of environmental laws for enforcing RCRA and similar sorts of hazardous waste laws. So I mean, it would be state and even local dependent, the sort of thing that we'd be happy to look into. But something like RCRA is another possible approach to that issue. If you have something like a hookah lounge or a smoking lounge, and they're collecting an awful lot of tobacco product waste or toxic water from the hookahs, that might qualify them as under RCRA for higher burdens for disposing of that waste. And so looking into enforcement mechanisms in that regards might be another avenue.
Yes, and for California, I think, making sure, I'm not sure where the requester is, they said they've received complaints. I'm not sure if they come from a particular agency, but generally reaching out to the certified unified program agencies in California that are tasked with managing the toxic or hazardous waste loss in California would be a good way to get a heads up and see what can we do about this particular problem, because it is unfortunately going to be very localized, since it is kind of needs a hands-on approach.
Another question here, asking for our thoughts on holding manufacturers accountable for the waste their products create, perhaps with take-back programs or drop boxes at retailer locations. And so I'll say at the outset, I absolutely love the idea of holding manufacturers responsible for their waste that they're producing. And you could do that a variety of different ways. Something like a take-back program or drop boxes, as Carolina mentioned, there are pros and cons with that. One of the benefits would, if done well and enforced rigidly, and especially if you ensure that the manufacturer or distributor is properly handling that toxic waste, would substantially increase the cost of doing business for them, while also hopefully reducing the amount of tobacco product waste being littered in our streets and going into our landfills. On the other hand, it does present an opportunity for greenwashing on behalf of industry. Similar to industry providing ashtrays in public places, it would give them an opportunity to say, hey, we're good corporate citizens, we're doing our best to take care of this problem. And so feel free to smoke to your heart's content, because you don't need to worry about the litter that you're creating. We have these drop boxes. So there are risks and rewards to it. I think really what it comes down to is how well is it enforced, and whether you can actually fully hold them accountable, or you just kind of give them a relatively cheap opt-out and take some of the political pressure away from the preferable approach, which would be endgame. But Carolina, I'm not sure if you want to add to that.
No, yeah, I think you covered it really well. I do want to maybe emphasize the fact that, because vapes are, dangerous when they are disposed, and they need to be disposed in a pretty decent way, there would have to be a pretty strict process for how those are accepted. I don't know that retailers would I mean, it is possible, and I don't want to, foreclose any options, but I don't know that retailers are the best place to do that, just simply because the people who are going to be tasked with having to deal with these are probably going to be people who work at the retailer shops, like the clerks, who, are generally not, there are definitely some equity concerns as to like who exactly is going to have to deal with, making sure that this is done correctly, or receiving them and putting them in baggies and having to handle all this toxic waste. So I think that maybe some kind of partnership with hazardous waste, storage, disposal, and treatment facilities locally would be a better source for being able to drop that off. Of course, take back schemes where the manufacturer is basically covering the cost. That would be ideal from the financial standpoint. Although for the practical application of it, I think that would need to be explored a little bit more, depending on the types of resources that are available within the community, the availability of facilities, and just making sure that there's an ongoing conversation with all involved parties.
Questions are kind of dropping off here at the end, and we are getting to the end of the hour here. I want to point out we do have materials available on our website and in other locations. Here's a list along with links. This will be available on our website if you want to check it out after the webinar. So I won't hold this up. You don't have to take notes while you're here live. It'll be available to you online. And we also are available to reach out to if you have direct questions, you'd like legal technical assistance on any of these or other issues. And unless there's anything else, I'm going to kick it over to Stephanie to round us off.
I'll say thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.